I was lost, and I couldn't find my way. Thank you, brother. Didn't you pray for me? But now I found Jesus. And now I'm so glad I can say that I thank the Lord. Hey, I'm on my way.
Well, we are on our way with Presbycast to our 300 plus one show. We'd like to welcome you to the 300 production put out by Presbycast. So we really can't believe it either. We can't believe you're still here. But if you're watching along or listening to this on demand, thank you for doing so. We've got, I think, what'll be a pretty great show coming up. It is Inauguration Eve. So as such, we're all anxiously waiting to see what comes down the wire for pardons, especially he who has sometimes been confused for the human Harambe, and that is Joe Exotic. So we keep looking at the news for hope that he might receive that pardon, for his frame job for which he's suffered these long years. So again, welcome to Presbycast. I'm Presbyterian. Chortles Weekly is here, possibly a guest. We're still waiting for that confirmation. But again, as one of our commenters said about 300 episodes, they didn't say it couldn't be done, only that it shouldn't. And the only season Presbycast needs is one of discontent. So I don't know that we could receive higher compliments than that. Means we're doing something right by doing everything else wrong. So here's to 300 more.
Well, and our guest is supposed to join us shortly. He's pretty technically savvy, so I think he's probably got a life and a lifestyle, unlike some of us. So he could have been a little bit busy, but we'll be joined very shortly by this our special guest. We hope, but if not, we have plenty of content to go on. So 300 episodes. It was a little hard to count because sometimes you'll have a duplicate if you make a correction. But I carefully counted, and this is number 300. That includes all bonus content, special content. We're not going to do much in the way of retrospective or anything like that. We were recently on the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast where we talked about ourselves and the show, probably far more than was necessary. So we'll let that suffice for a show about the show, but we won't have much more to say about that tonight. But we did receive a little audio card from our friend Scott Clark, everyone's favorite prolific a podcaster, reform guy, cataloger of information, and hurler of tweet storms. But he sent us a message, and let's he solves one mystery for us. As many of you know, our producer, Silent Topher, has sort of been AWOL, but I think in this little audio card that Scott sent us, we have a hint as to where Silent Topher might be. But it begins with, maybe one of the first times we mentioned Scott on the Presbycast. Here we go.
That I did see R. Scott Clark 2 weeks ago over in Nashville. He's much younger looking, and he's a pretty good looking guy.
Maybe even some help from an essay from our guest. Became convinced of infant baptism.
Hey guys, it's Scott Clark from the Heidelcast. When I'm on the internet, I always listen to the Presbycast. I mean, where else can one go to get their fill of amateur, old-school Southern gospel? Congratulations to Chortles and Resby on your 300th episode of Presbycast. Proud to be one of the third Presbycasters and thankful for all you do. Hang on, there's something on the doorbell camera. Oh, it's that stupid Silent Topher. Go get him, girl.
Oh, I'm worried. I'm worried about Topher now, as we know his relationship to the Heidel dog is, troubled and stormy and violent. But maybe he'll be okay.
It's Topher and the Heidel dog. It's like driving a dump truck into a nitroglycerin plant.
Indeed. And as we're still waiting for our guest to join us, everybody's favorite is Fun with Baptist. Resby, when did we start Fun with Baptist? It seems like just a couple of years ago. We certainly haven't been doing it since day one. And the source and who we have to thank for these are a number of Twitter accounts, IFB sermon clips, and this one tonight is from Sawdust Trail Satire. So be sure to follow that account. They were nice to let us use this, but when did we start it, Resby?
Now, we've been having fun at Baptist expense since day one.
Well, that's true.
But this segment, I want to say at the earliest, maybe late 2019. We may not have even we didn't start doing it regularly, certainly until last year, 2020. And even then, it may not have been until, after the initial stripping of our constitutional rights in March or something like that.
Could have been. Maybe it was a COVID reaction. Maybe even worse than the reaction some people have to the vaccine. So, all right. Well, let's play the theme.
We had to laugh at something in March.
That's right. Might as well be Baptist. Well, let's play the intro and get to this one. So, what you want to listen for here is, there's something about a lion. And the soundboard is dead. Hang on, let's restart that. Don't know what that's about. It worked earlier, so let's try that again.
What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms.
Welcome to Fun with Baptists on your favorite podcast, Presbycast. And now, Baptists.
We'll make a little announcement to see if you'll come here with me. The devil really is going to give it all he's got to take over this earth. He's going to give it all he's got to take over this earth. And you're seeing it right now. You're seeing it right now. They're trying to take over this nation. They're liable to be successful because God's liable to be done with the providential purposes of this nation. He's probably done. I don't know how much longer our lion can roar. He's got the yellow mane, the orange skin, and I know you could say so much about him, but I tell you one thing, it looked like a sovereign God put him in place, and the first thing he did was he chose Israel over Islam. And he laid his hand on a born-again man who keeps an open Bible on every desk of his staff and said, "You're going to be my running partner." Can I get a witness right there? He's got the yellow mane and he's got the orange skin. And he roars righteousness when he's not tweeting other things. But he roars righteousness. Oh, I love how he marched over to the church, St. John's, and come out of there with the King James Bible and held it up, and that line glared at the world. Amen. Thank God. I don't know how much longer the roar of a lion, the roar of the universal language, the English language, the roar of the Word of God. I don't know how much longer the roar of the lion is going to be allowed. I got a feeling we're at the very end. But give it 7 years and they're going to hear another roar. Behold the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Amen. Let that dragon breathe fire. God, there's going to be another roar. The Son of God's going to open his mouth.
Well, there you go. So that's our current events. Now, this was actually from back in August, but I guess this gives some credence to the David Frenches of the world, or David Vichy French, we call him, who are convinced that evangelicalism, Southern evangelicalism, dispensationalists, etc., are responsible for everything. But Resby, your reaction to that very fun Baptist?
It seems like what more? I mean, what more can you say? I mean, it's wonderful. I will read the transcript of this to my children as they fall asleep tomorrow. Some of them fortunate enough to be, to be born in the Lions administration. So, I think for that they have to be grateful, and just really centers them and shows them what's important.
Well, we should
In fact,
say
I may
that
actually I might just print out that picture and put it as wallpaper.
We should say that since the new administration comes in tomorrow, allegedly, that this could be the last Presbycast if what we hear is true. We could be memory.
It
hold.
is a shame. I mean, we've basically got I figure we got about 24 good hours, and then Thursday we'll be dead.
Well, you've heard me talk about preacher stories before and how they're not always true. And note that the preacher man said that the president held up a King James Bible, and there's the picture. And our viewers can see that it says Revised Standard Version, which was the sort of the first mainline non-King James Bible. So fake news, as they say. Well, what's not fake news is that our guest has joined us. I'm going to unmute him and see if he's there. Gabe Williams of sunny Florida. Florida man, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, the audio's not great, but you're okay.
Yeah, sorry. I don't have my usual setup. I'm working off my laptop. No mic.
All right. Well, we'll work with that. So, Gabe, you're a ruling elder down in Florida, and just a slice of real Presby life. I just got a text from for my session, and your church is supporting my church's church plant.
Wow, that happened fast. I think I just sent a message maybe an hour ago or so, right after our session meeting.
And I had nothing to do with it. I was not the middleman, and it happened without me. I didn't even know.
Well, I saw Rev Blev, talking about the church plant, and so I joined the prayer group on Facebook, and I've been keeping track of them that way. And we finalized our budget, but we hadn't allocated how we were divvying it up. And there was a couple that we stopped, a few things that we changed, and we tried to increase wherever we could, and we wanted to add something new. And I made the case that we don't have enough conservative confessional church plants. So whether it's in our immediate area or not, it was still a worthwhile home mission to support what you guys are doing up there. So there you go.
Yeah, what we found, and this is, it's sort of sad and interesting that there are so few what we would call ordinary means of grace, confessional, simple church plants out there, that there's actually a pent-up demand for them, and there are a number of churches that are willing to support them. So, and again, it's interesting. You noted that there was a prayer group that some people don't think Presbyterians even pray that much, but there we go. It happens.
Right.
So, and since you've got a little noise, I'll mute you when you're not speaking. So
sorry, my wife is watching Peggy Sue Got Married, I think, in the room.
Well, I don't hear any movie stuff going on, so that's all right. We're not going to blame your wife, but there you are in your new house in Florida. I know you just moved.
Yeah,
and, I was
have to get set up for these.
It was great to be able to visit your church back around Thanksgiving. I think it was.
Yeah, it was good having you.
Met in person and didn't get COVID or anything. So that's good. So well, we're going to talk about a number of things tonight. PCA among them, and you're a PCA ruling elder like I am, and we only have famous, well-known guests on this show. We never have a nobody like me or Resby or you on here. So we try to stay with the sort of garage band Presbyterian ethic most of the time.
If I was on your show, that meant I was an up and coming. No,
no, that means you're marked for destruction, I think.
Right. This is how not to be voted to committees. Be on PresbyCast.
Speaking of marks, we're going to talk about the marks of the church, but let me kick it off with, I think, something a few people missed. John Payne, who's sort of head of the Gospel Reformation Network, which is a group of conservative confessional PCA pastors, was recently on Mortification of Spin, and he said something that I think a lot of people sort of missed. And my history with John Payne goes back all the way to the early 20-teens when we were building our church. Our building committee drove down and visited his church, his then church in Georgia. He's now in Charleston, South Carolina. But we visited his church because, they had built an affordable, simple, ordinary means of grace church building. And I didn't meet him that day, but we visited the church and went to a conference, heard Michael Horton speak down at his church in, around 2010 probably. But he was on Mortification of Spin recently and talked about an upcoming event, which is sort of a trigger for what we're going to talk about tonight. So I have permission from Mortification of Spin to play this. So it's a short clip. Let's hear what John Payne, PCA pastor, had to say.
You have another event coming up in May that's going to be held at Briarwood PCA in Birmingham. John, what's going to be happening there?
Yes, that'll be May 5th and 6th. The Briarwood session just approved that to be held at Briarwood, which is where the PCA started in 1973. And that conference, while it will have an in-person dynamic, people will be encouraged to come and to be there presently. We're going to really focus on the virtual side of things so that pastors and sessions can gather together and listen to lectures from leading men in the PCA on some of the issues that are plaguing the PCA. Mm-hmm. One of those, of course, would be the social justice and critical theory that is taking root. If we look at the two very prominent articles that have come out in the past year, one by Greg Johnson on gay celibate Christianity, and also a recent one by Christina Edmondson on the racial injustices, and then, of course, the newest MTW Network magazine, what racial justice have to do with missions. And I underlined several things in that issue which were a big concern, where we have adopted kind of the assumptions of the culture as it concerns race, as it concerns social justice. And so we're going to speak into those things. And there'll be a State of the PCA address as well, and encouraging the PCA to be who she's called to be, true to the scriptures, faithful to the Reformed faith, and obedient to the Great Commission. That's what we want to call the PCA back to.
All right. So this meeting is, I think it's fairly significant because it's at the church where the PCA was formed. And I think it underscores the level of concern with certain issues in the PCA, the discontent of some within her, and the fact that, well, it's a critical time. I think the case could be made that the PCA is in crisis. I don't know how many people actually appreciate that and realize it. Gabe, you have any feelings about that?
Well, I didn't realize the extent of things until just within the last couple of years. I think I've said that before. I was really stuck in my local church, not being very involved in Presbytery or GA. So all of this is kind of new to me. So I thought, 2.5 years ago, wow, this handbasket's hotter than I thought. But I don't know if we're really at the point where I would give up hope. I would say it is a critical time, but I've wrestled back and forth with some of the churches leaving, some of the men leaving, and the conversation about how long do you stay. And I kind of feel like we took an oath to work for the peace and the purity of the denomination. And I don't think we're anywhere near the point where it's okay to abandon ship. I think that it is a very important time for us to take a stand one way or another, because things are going to get very difficult, I believe, in the near future for religious liberty. And we're going to lose our voice if we don't stick to our guns on some of these core issues. And I think we can do it in a manner that's truthful and loving, but honest and forthright. So I don't think we're actually sunk yet, but we're taking on water. And over the last year or two, it seems like the holes are getting bigger. So yeah, crisis, yes. Beyond hope, Christ Church is never beyond hope. So what we need to do is do what y'all are doing and plant more confessional churches and make sure that we are training up our young men to be solid, conservative, confessional, ruling and teaching elders, and they need to take part in the denomination. The progressive side is working very hard, it seems, behind the scenes to shape the PCA into what they want it to be, while we are working very hard up front to I hope, keep it what it's supposed to be, what it was intended to be, and that one honored. That's what will honor God. So I think we need to stick to our guns.
All right. I'm not implying that there's not going to be a convocation of sessions, which is what happens when you form a new denomination at this meeting. But this meeting is triggered by stresses, strains, and I think what can fairly be called a crisis in the PCA. And my thoughts about forming a new denomination or leaving are much along the lines of yours, Gabe. But there's not a lot of careful thought about this. There aren't a lot of, you're not going to go read an article about this sort of thing. It's sort of buried deep in the literature, some of it, the idea of what makes a church a true church, or one that you should hang on to. Or, we still have people who consider themselves biblical Christians hanging on in the PCUSA of all things. And I think we would all say that ship has sailed, but that's not to say it's without Christians and completely without worth, but it's being if it's blessing anyone, it's doing so in spite of itself, not because of its governing ethos. But let's talk about the marks of the church. Now, I don't know that you can go to various reformers. You're going to find 2 or 3 marks of the church, and some people, as I'll mention, would like to add a 4th one. Calvin only had 2, preaching and sacraments, but the traditional 3 marks of the church that people in the Reformation talk about is the right preaching of the word, and that would encompass doctrine, proper administration of the sacraments, which are only 2 in our world, and then, of course, preaching includes gospel and doctrine, and the sacraments also obviously touch on the gospel. So the first 2 points are about the gospel, and the third is really about the application of the doctrine and the gospel, and that is discipline. Now, when we think about discipline, we think about kicking so-and-so out of the church because he unbiblically divorced his wife or got a DUI or something. But that's not that's not all that discipline means here. Although we know that many evangelical churches, mega churches, contemporary churches know nothing of church discipline of any kind, or only in the most extreme cases. So that is part of it. But in my mind, discipline also includes ecclesiology. It includes church order. It includes even worship, because that's part of our order, and really is part of it's just kind of the structure and backbone of our church. So sacraments, preaching, and discipline are the 3 marks. Some people would say there should be a 4th one, which interestingly was not even included in the Baptist 9 marks. They had 9 to work with, and they couldn't get this one in, but that's proper worship. Proper worship could easily come under discipline as well, because our BCO talks about worship. The Directory of Public Worship is obviously about worship. That's part of our order, part of our discipline. The BCO is our book of discipline, and it touches on all these things. So we could add a fourth mark, proper worship, but that can also be subsumed under really all 3, preaching, sacraments, and discipline. So as we look at any church, the PCA, whatever church you may be in, the rubric for evaluating are these traditionally these 3 marks, though it's not set in stone anywhere. One way to think of discipline is the application of a biblical truth, and discipline and sacraments are also related, because you don't get those sacraments if you're under discipline. But Gabe and Resby, do you buy the marks of the church concept?
I do, and I do think that proper worship falls under discipline. I mean, we often, as you alluded to, we often think of the word discipline as just the punishment piece, but discipline, you think of a discipline, the way you do things, the standard, the structure, that's all part of discipline, a disciplined lifestyle. So worship, being orderly, being proper, being biblical, that's, I think, part of discipline. So I wouldn't even, I guess in response to the way some churches attempt worship these days, it might be necessary to add that 4th mark. But I would think that a good confessional Reformed session would understand that proper worship falls under proper discipline. And really, discipline should be an encouraging, a training, an opportunity for growth and deeper understanding. There should be so much good to discipline before it becomes extremely uncomfortable, or before people start looking at it like punishment, because always restoration is the goal. So we don't want to run anybody off. We want them to have a changed heart.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad that you mentioned discipline. Like, we always think of it as punitive rather than sort of like just the administrative way that we go about things. Or like, especially like the structure and just the way, the commitment you keep to it. I've said it before. I think one of my favorite lines in HBO's The Wire is from season 3 when they are reviewing.
A man must have a code. Oh, no doubt.
When they're reviewing just the system with which the criminal organization goes to avoid detection over communications, and Lester Freeman just kind of sits back and says, "You have to admire the discipline," and in some ways, that's exactly what we're talking about. Is it's hard to stay committed to basic, simple, true Presbyterian worship. It's much harder to stay that way than it is to change over time.
You dropped off.
And oh, am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
All right. And so I like, it's hard not to change over time. And even though it's been sort of eisegeted the way evangelicals always seem to do, it does sort of, 1 Corinthians 9 at the end of the chapter, Paul talking about, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. I think there's a real sense in which that can be applied to worship, that is our discipline and the way that we're disciplining ourselves moving forward. So, it's hard, and I think it should be a defining mark of the church, because when you walk into a Reformed church, it almost always stands out if you've never been in one before.
Okay, have on the screen for our live viewers an article by Bob Godfrey, Marks of the Church. It's on the Ligonier website. You can easily find it. That's the place to start. One of our listeners notes that Guido de Brays, one of the writers of the Belgic Confession, Belgic 29, Belgic Confession 29 is another place to go to find these. Maybe one of the first places that was apparent. I'm not sure. But it's very easy to find information on this if you want to know more about the marks of the church. But we have to think about these marks as we think about the church we're in, whether you're choosing a local church for your family or whether a session is evaluating its affiliation, or whether you're a church member voting on the affiliation of your church, all these things. And in a lot of evangelical churches and maybe a lot of Presbyterian churches, there's not a lot of thought about these things. But Gabe, I mean, you've been thinking about these things, and we have, and it's one of the jobs of the elder.
Yeah, and it's
no fun.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It is, but it's not. I mean, it's kind of like parenting. It can be the most and the least rewarding thing you ever do at the same time. But it is something, especially, I mean, I hate to sound like an old codger, but in this day and age, I think it's even more important, because culturally speaking, you're getting nothing from but garbage from every angle. So it is important that we're making sure that things are done orderly, biblically, that we're teaching not just to please, to tickle the ears, but to really help people understand. I hate to say to live out, your Christianity, but there is a standard in how we live. The law is there also to guide us and keep us in check and help us to love our neighbor properly. If we have that proper doctrine, that proper discipline, that's when we can truly love our neighbors as we would love ourselves, because we want what's right and good rather than what's popular, convenient, or seems fun at the time. So it is a tough job sometimes.
All right, let's talk about the reasons that in the PCA in particular, there's this stress, this conflict that would lead some people to consider leaving. And we know that Vanguard Presbytery is sort of a kind of a new school well, they're old school, they say, but new side, I think, and more revivalist, more associated with the old Presbyterian Evangelistic Fellowship, now called Reformed Evangelistic Fellowship. The leaders of that offshoot of the PCA. I did a couple of years ago. I attended their kind of pre-formation meeting out of curiosity. Andy Webb was there. He has since been one of those churches that has left to join the ARP. And we know that we've said many times there's not a flood of churches leaving the PCA. There's a trickle, and of course there are always churches affiliating with the PCA too. The numbers are not significant or noteworthy, but they're not. They are there. There is the fact that churches are leaving, and we should talk about why and why other churches are at least beginning to think about these things. And the reasons are familiar if we're in any way tuned into the cultural issues of the day. The reasons are the big three are sex, gender, and race. Imagine that. That sounds like like the rest of America, Gabe.
Yeah, that's. I think the people that are leaving are just concerned that we've gone too far, down that slippery slope. There's no going back. That you definitely see the stamp of the culture on our church, on the PCA, and the AR. You mentioned Andy and the ARP. They are starting, actually, from what I understand, to talk about not having female deacons any longer. So that would be one of the very few and far between cases of a denomination tightening up, becoming a little more conservative rather than going the other way. And I think that's what people are afraid, that those big three issues that are just warping reality in culture are also encroaching upon the PCA and warping our reality. And my wife and I talk about this all the time. In all three of the things you mentioned, people focus so much, and when I say people, I mean on the progressive side that are being influenced by the culture in our church. They focus on those things so much and feel so sorry for the people involved in it that they fail to just realize the reality that it's sin, and that's the problem that needs to be dealt with, not repenting for something you didn't do or allowing something you shouldn't allow to attract a certain segment of the population. We should be breaking people up into two groups, pagan and Christian, and we should be reaching the pagans with the gospel, and we should be teaching the Christians the disciplines of God. It's that simple.
All right, so when we talk about sex, really we're talking about revoice. We're talking about what they would call the issues of sexual minorities. We would call it gay Christianity, or I'm not sure. There are different ways to describe this. So when we talk about sex, we really mean the LGBT issues. There are more. There's a plus, and there's other letters, and I don't know all of them. Maybe the new Health and Human Services transgender person that the incoming president has appointed will probably enlighten us on the full alphabet soup of designations, which really exceed even the Presbyterian split P multi letter designations. But at any rate, sex refers to revoice, and the same SSA gay Christian movement in the PCA typified by Greg Johnson of Church in Missouri Presbytery, and everyone who followed the last General Assembly knows about this. When we talk about gender, we're talking about women's roles typically, and women in leadership roles, or women presented as officers or quasi-officers, or sort of halfway covenant office. And then the third race that has to do with racial reconciliation. And interestingly, that's probably the least controversial of the three. And it probably didn't feel like that in 2015. But really, as we've seen, really a new segregation and sort of I don't want to say radicalization in like a dangerous, violent way, but there's been a split among sort of the woke and the more moderate. So that problem, in a way, from if we look at individuals, it's sort of curing itself to some degree. So you grant that those three are the big three issues.
I would say so. In regards to all three, something that I see a lot in conversations, some of our private Facebook groups and things like that, where we debate some of these issues, I see very often that the progressives, the ones who are more willing to bend to these cultural issues, they will often label the rest of us who are against women in office in the church, or who will call homosexuality a sin, or who will say, I shouldn't love my brother any more or less based on his color. I should just be dealing with the sin in all three. They paint us as unloving, uncaring. It's funny that they who would add so much to the gospel will often also call us Pharisees. But I've never taken the Westboro Baptist Church approach and just shook my fist at folks that fall into those categories, or who look different than me, or whose culture is different than mine, and said they were wrong or they were doomed or whatever because of that. But I would talk about the sin issue, no matter what it is, and treat them with dignity as an image bearer of God. And let's talk about the gospel and how these things that you're doing or living or thinking fit or don't fit into that. And it's very frustrating at times trying to have a conversation with someone who just immediately thinks you're hateful because you want to call sin, or because you don't feel that you should be blamed for something you didn't do, and would never do. And that's where I think that you can see that cultural pressure that comes into the church, where we often adopt that same cancel type culture and that same language and animosity towards people who are more conservative or confessional when it comes to those three big subjects.
Yeah, and of course, confessionalists can be too harsh and judgmental in some ways as well. We should admit that. But when we talk about the culture and the fact that, I was talking to someone today, and they said that our real problem is sort of our cultural captivity, or our desire to please the culture. That's one way to describe it. But really, I would think that some of this is part and parcel to the missional, contextual city church ethos, which I really think comes from, ultimately you can draw a line back to Francis Schaeffer and Harvey Kahn and some figures like that, maybe Jack Miller, not our Twitter friend Jack Miller, but another Jack Miller. Figures like that have always tried to think about how to impact, to reach, to influence the culture, and to appeal to thought leaders and city people. And we know that the cultural leaders are in New York, and they're in D.C., and that they're in Los Angeles, Hollywood. And there's always been a desire to reach out to them, thinking that if we can influence the leaders of culture, we'll change the culture. I think that's easier said than done, but really, one way to look at this is a divide between those who would prefer a simpler, more modest approach to the mission of the church, to those who would be called missionalists, those who are big on contextualization, transformation of the culture or a place or city or community. And that would be, the poster child for that would be Tim Keller. For all the good he's done, he would be, and he's certainly much more solid than a lot of people who maybe have been inspired by him. He might not agree with that, but I think that's a fair statement. But there are other issues beyond. There are other ways to look at this. There are other divides and flashpoints, maybe. And let me run through these, and then I'll ask Gabe and Resby what they think about them. There are issues of confessional subscription. We know that back in the early 2000s, the PCA voted in provision to allow what's called good faith subscription, which means you can take a number of exceptions. They just need to be recorded. Presbyteries need to approve them. So kind of a difference between full or nearly full confessional subscription and a much and a looser way of regarding the confessions. A great diversity in worship, I still think, is, while the PCA is better in some ways liturgically than it's ever been, there's still a real diversity in the way worship is done across the denomination. Some people think that's a great thing. Some people think it's less than ideal. There are a lot of different philosophies of ministry. That's a phrase that we see a lot. And it depending on your understanding of the church, maybe you think there should be many ways of doing church, or maybe you think that's a much more constrained or limited thing, that there shouldn't be a dozen philosophies of ministry, that there should be basically one. There are differing views on sanctification and the law. That probably explains why the GRN, which we mentioned earlier, that John Payne is associated with, that's really I think they were really formed sort of in reaction to Tully and Tavigian theology, or maybe sonship theology. There are other variants of that. There's also just a differing regard for Presbyterian distinctives. Some people seem to be a little more evangelical than Presbyterian, and some people are Presbyterians and don't even want to denominate themselves evangelicals, at least in common parlance. So Resby and Gabe, those other issues they're sort of manifestations of the big three. Well, maybe the big three we talked about are manifestations of these other factors and vectors that I've described.
I don't know if you're breaking up or I'm breaking up, but
yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but I think we're on.
Hopping.
Resby, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. So which came first, the chicken or the egg here?
I do like this comment. Don't all three of those issues really boil down to the inerrancy and sufficiency of Scripture? I think you can make a very strong case that.
And I think more for sufficiency than inerrancy.
Yes, I would agree. I don't think there's no one in the PCA who would say Scripture is not inerrant. But it seems like there are quite a few who may act as though it's not completely sufficient in some ways, and so that's usually the challenge that it seems like the confessional Presbyterians tend to butt up against, is saying like, no, this is enough. Like if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, and that thing is faithfulness to Scripture, that is like the exception to that definition of insanity Einstein proverb. I mean, it's what we're supposed to be doing, and so we can kind of rely and rest on that. And I remember talking with a former pastor of mine about this very thing a long time ago, is that it almost always boils down to how you view Scripture at the heart. It may start out on the fringe, but if you really keep going down, it's, I think that, Scripture speaks sufficiently on this, and the other person would say, well, I don't. And until you both agree that it does, you will probably not have a final resolution.
Yeah, and this is where I need to say what I always say, which there are no theological liberals in the classical sense in the PCA. I think some people disagree with that statement, don't buy it, but we'll ask Gabe when I unmute him here. Do you agree, Gabe, that conservative liberal in the theological sense is not really the most helpful way of looking at this?
Well, it's funny because when you said what you said about evangelical, I said I knew that was going to make an appearance sooner or later. I see some pretty big stretches. If you read Christianity and liberalism and you want to compare, the liberal of that day, then maybe nobody in the PCA would go that far. But I see some pretty big stretches. I do. But you were talking about diversity in worship, and that's one thing about the PCA. I've talked to people who they're like, well, we were traveling, so we found a PCA church and we went in, and I'm not just talking about New York, but and they were doing the Lord's Supper different way, like crazy stuff. They were like serving Lord's Supper 2 or 3 different ways at the same time. It was kind of how you.
And there could be intinction. There could be children serving the elements.
Right.
I've heard about, yeah.
And then one pastor I was talking to one time, we were talking about, well, what if you go from once a month to every week communion? And his reaction was, well, if you do that, you have to wonder, will the elders be overworked? Would you want to start letting lay people serve? And if so, then women would be able to help distribute the elements, and even you mentioned children. So there is a lot of diversity in the way we do things, even within the PCA. And when it comes to good faith subscription, there was one. So it is up to the presbytery whether they accept the exception or not, but the BCO also says you can't bind their conscience, and that kind of came up at the last GA with Calvary Presbytery accepting, but telling him he couldn't teach, telling the candidate he couldn't teach that exception. And to me, I think that's reasonable. If you are so hardcore on that rule that you won't allow a presbytery to rule that way, and allow the candidate to say, okay, I'll make the exception, I won't teach it, then basically what you're doing is excluding some men from, being a teaching elder. If you can't tell them we don't agree with that exception, but we don't think it strikes at the vitals, but we don't want you to teach it, then your only alternative would be to not let that person be ordained. And so it's funny because for all the rules that we have as a denomination to create uniformity, there is still a lot of diversity, and not in a good way, I don't think. I grew up personally Baptist, so it was pretty easy. At the business meetings, the deacons would yell at each other, and then the pastor would make a decision, and we would go eat. So things got done a lot more quickly. And if you could convince the pastor, then you were in like Flynn. No, I don't necessarily. We've been going through a pastor search, so it has been refreshing. It's been very helpful being part of a denomination. We were able to use teaching elders from Central Florida Presbytery and do pulpit supply so that we could serve communion and things like that. So being part of a denomination is great, but there are definitely some weird things going on within our denomination.
Yeah,
and I think probably good faith was the start of a lot of it, wasn't it?
Yeah. Although, well, this is a good time to mention something that I was thinking about today. I think one of the issues that probably set us back was the Federal Vision controversy. It was a huge distraction for years, and I think it came to a head in kind of around 2007, but had been present in the church from the mid or late 90s, or maybe even the early 90s, up in, for a good 10 years. That was a distraction, and it probably kept confessionalists from dealing with some of these things. And of course, it was a huge deal because it touched on justification and sacraments and the very nature of the church. But I was thinking about today, I guess I'm given to these generalizations and excesses, but I thought, well, I could pretty much blame Doug Wilson for everything that's gone wrong in the PCA, but that's probably not a popular point of view. But yeah, if you look at it, there was some fatigue from that. And again, it was just a distraction because the church can't deal with multiple things at one time. One of the things that, the Northern Church already had female deacons in Machen's time, and I think female elders came in very, very soon after. You don't hear Machen wasn't fighting about officers; he was fighting about the gospel, and so when you've got this variety of problems, you can't really address them all at one time. And that can sort of give life to some of those problems and let them coast along, fly under the radar, and pop back up, or metastasize, or however you want to view that. So Federal Vision was a distraction and maybe hurt the efforts to deal with some of these things or to achieve understanding and unity on some of these things. So. And you talked about the blessings of denominationalism and being in a denomination, and there certainly are many. So one of the things we should look at is reasons that we should stay and not leave for no good reason, which is called schism. That's called being schismatic, and that's something that's always we've always been counseled not to be schismatic, and that's thought to be a sin, to divide for no good reason, and for at the wrong time, if you will. So let's talk about that. Reasons that we might want to that anyone might say you shouldn't leave your denomination except in the most extreme circumstances. Well, the extreme circumstances we've already mentioned would be that the marks of the church are clearly gone. I think we can say in the PCA the marks of the church are not yet clearly gone, and should we merely part over what we perceive as a trajectory. I think Gabe, you're troubled with the trajectory, but what do you think about what would have to happen to make you think that staying is no longer the best thing?
Well, I think, if the standard of the PCA was not biblical, faithful, confessional, if what we were accepting as a denomination just became, the rule, then I would say it's time to go. Just like those who stayed in the PCUSA until they just saw, now we're allowing things that are flat out unbiblical. We can't hide behind it's a style issue. Now we're just flat out going against Scripture, clearly going against Scripture, not disciplining people for things that are clearly sin. I think that would probably be the time to go. And I'm not talking about a presbytery not doing what we would like them to do, or a presbytery even doing something different than what our presbytery would do, right? If you have, for the most part, faithful men who are upholding the three mentioned marks of the church and being true to our polity, our book and church order, the confession, and most importantly, Scripture, then I think there's still room to stay and try to do everything you can to right the ship, to keep it as faithful as you can for as long as you can. But yeah, I mean, there is a point, I think, where you have to realize that there is no going back, and there's just not enough faithful brothers left, that we can call the denomination as a whole faithful. That would be time to go. Where you would go, I don't know, but because it seems like, we have a few really solid confessional denominations left on the planet, and where would we go from here other than to start our own thing, which of course would have its flaws too.
Yeah. So we talk about trajectory. Another way we could look at this is sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. I think some people would say that, yeah, there's no one huge thing right now, but I don't like the way this is going, and I don't want to wait for where it's going. Now, that could be considered lack of faith or believing the worst of your brethren, or there may be various ways to criticize that approach, but people are human, and people have the ability, common sense and the ability to analyze, and some people may in good conscience make a choice, like I would say Andy Webb did, that it's just not going to work, and it's time for me, for him, for his church to do something else. Another reason, and we've already alluded to this, not to divide, is the difficulty of starting something new, or even of joining another denomination. We should say that it's very easy for a church to vote to leave the PCA, but that doesn't mean it's an easy thing to do. I mean, some newer churches, a church planted 5 years ago, they may have no history with the denomination and no emotional attachment to a denomination, but that's not the case for older churches, and it's just not an easy thing to do that. And there are no ideal churches. Every other NAPARC church would have its downsides as well. So it is a difficult thing. We should also mention that it's not up to pastors. It's not even entirely up to sessions. A session would propose it, but then a congregational vote would be required. It's not up to the preacher man, and so it's not an individual thing. because if you are an individual committed to a church, you're going to be in whatever denomination that church is in. But, you know, I've heard some pastors say that there are people who are leaving my PCA church because they don't like what's going on in the PCA. So there are individuals voting with their feet and going elsewhere because of what's happening in the wider PCA. And, you know, that's hard for pastors and ruling elders to hear. And that's a stress on some churches. So there's not any one way of the churches are dealing with this.
And I would venture to say that that's happening more in the last 3 or 4 years probably than ever before, because most people don't even know much about their denomination, what's going on nationally, worldwide with the denomination. They know their local church, they know their pastor, their session, their friends, and their covenant family, and they don't really know what else. But over the last 3 or 4 years, as you know, everybody has a phone, everybody is live streaming. We're live streaming GA. People are sitting at home now I was surprised to find out that there were several of our members watching the live stream of GA. And why in the world a layperson would want to watch that for entertainment is beyond me. But
it's like BattleBots, of course.
Exactly. But
why wouldn't you?
More people are. So because of the internet, the reach and the availability of these meetings and everything, there's a lot more. I wouldn't say that the process wasn't transparent before, but it's just so much easier now to even stumble upon the process if you're Googling things about your denomination or whatever. So we came back from GA, and we had a small group of congregants wanting to know what the heck was going on and where we stood on these issues. And I thought it was great. I loved that they were involved. I loved that they were concerned, and I loved that they wanted to hear from us about it. So I thought it was great. But I think that's going to happen more and more. And then you have folks actually putting websites out that are letting people know, who signed the protest, who is for this, who's against this. And I personally like that transparency. One thing I tell people, and it may cause some trouble, but if once in a while Google your pastor's name. You know what I mean? See what he's signing on to, what he's agreeing with, who he's associating with. You might be surprised. Because one thing I noticed, and I think both sides do it, the progressive side and the confessional side, they both, will put out a statement and encourage people to sign it, right? Jump on this so we know that you're like-minded on this. Well, your pastor's not going to then send an email to the congregation saying, hey, I just signed on to this open letter. So Google is your friend. See what he's up to. Ask him. Ask your officers where they stand on some of these issues. Don't let it be such a surprise. So I think that's going to happen more and more. People are going to hear what's going on, and they're going to go somewhere else. Now, we've had over the years people do that now and then, not because of what we were doing necessarily, but because of the direction of the PCA or what they saw. But at least in Volusia County, we have two PCA churches and another that we would consider Reformed. There's a Reformed Baptist church, kind of a mega church thing. And so we don't really have a lot of Reformed options. If you leave because you're not happy with the PCA, you don't have a lot of choices. So some of the folks that we've lost over the years because of that came back because they decided that we as a congregation were faithful. And so I think that that's important, that the faithful congregations do everything they can, regardless of where the PCA is going, to be as faithful as they can to Scripture.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I sort of I think if good churches left the PCA prematurely, I think it hurts the marginal areas and states more than
Yes.
in South Carolina. Sure, there's going to be plenty of confessional churches you could go to, and but think about in the Northeast or even in Florida, if the hand of the confessional faithful PCA churches is weakened, it hurts all the people that live in those areas. I was talking to my wife about that this week. What we really are connected, and it really does make a difference. And what you do, you have to take all that into consideration. I think, just as we want to be considerate of our NAPARC brethren when we plant churches, but also how we act and what we do in the PCA. It does affect other churches. But I know in Florida, it's a big state and there are a lot of churches and a lot of people, but there aren't that many of certain types of churches.
Right.
And we should be mindful of that, because in some presbyteries it's going to, if there was a new denomination in 2 years, there may be a few whole presbyteries that join. But that's not going to happen where you live.
No,
it's just not, and it's going to make it hard on a lot of people. So that's a consideration.
Right, and I think you're right. I think that's kind of where I was going with it earlier about not leaving prematurely. Not that we're the saviors, right? It's God's church. It's God's church, but we were called to be faithful men and to work towards the peace and purity of the PCA. We can't do that by weakening it, by leaving. And I would say each time a faithful church leaves, it leaves a bigger weakness than they realize, because there's less votes at presbytery, less votes at GA, less good teaching, less accountability, less of all the good stuff that comes with being connected. So
yeah, let me bring in a retail story here. I used to work in a retail business, and my boss told me, he said, and we sold used equipment and professional equipment and things. And he said, the first discount you make is the most important one. The first time you cut the price, if you don't cut it enough, you have to cut it more later to sell it. If you cut it too much, you cut your own throat. So it's a matter of timing. If you left a denomination too early, you would leave with fewer numbers and a weaker position, I think. And if you left it much too late, that also would be the case. But so timing is important, and some of it's just there's nothing easy about it, and I won't say that there's no formula. It's difficult, but timing is important. The numbers are important. We don't need another micro denomination, I don't think, and we need to be careful about that, I think.
Well, I think what we need to do when a church session starts having the conversation, we got to get out of the PCA. Maybe instead the conversation they should have is, how can we plant a church? How can we plant a faithful church for the PCA in our area? What else can we? Oh, sorry about that. I didn't mean to insult anybody. And I certainly didn't mean to imply that watching GA on live stream was fun. So, but
it was fun when they still had comments.
That would be fun.
No, it was awesome. It was fully awesome, and then they quickly realized what they'd done and got rid of them.
What a bad idea that
was. They had a feed of the hashtag, and it was interesting.
I bet. But yeah, I would say when you start having that conversation, then maybe the conversation needs to be, what can we do? Instead of putting this energy into finding a place to go or creating something for ourselves, which is not Presbyterian, put that energy into how can we help on the presbytery level. What can we do to make a difference? What plant a church. I think I'm so happy that you guys are doing that, and that was one of the things I said tonight. I had John email me kind of the one sheet, the sell sheet is what I would call it, for introducing the church plant back in November. And, as I mentioned, we were going crazy with the filling pulpit and search committee and all that stuff. So when we finally got around to allocating the budget tonight, I brought it back and I said, hey, this is a solid confessional church, and this is what we need in the PCA. We need to support these church plants because, again, we don't want to say that there are any theological liberals, but there are a lot of very progressive church planters out there. And if we have the opportunity to support a good confessional church, we definitely need to do that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some other reasons, maybe not to jump the gun. I'll just maybe I'm playing devil's advocate in some cases here, but I believe this as well. It is difficult to start something new. It's difficult to move. We mentioned that. I think a reason it might not be honorable for confessionalists to leave the PCA is that we haven't really fought. I don't think we've left it all in the court, as they say. To go on with the basketball analogy, we haven't taken a lot of charging fouls. I don't think we've done ticky-tack. My dad was a basketball coach, and he loved defense, and he didn't like ticky-tack foul calls. He didn't like what he called hacking and grabbing, but he loved it when someone got a charge. And I just don't think he would make his players practice taking charging fouls and run over each other. It was very violent. He was a lot like a football coach. But I don't think there's a lot of blood on the floor after GA. He had a drill where they would have to fight over the ball until somebody bled. I'm sorry if this disturbs anyone, but I'm telling the truth. And I think sometimes we're too nice, and we've been too reticent to mix it up, and that's just some personality types can't handle that. But I personally don't think there's been enough of maybe there hasn't been enough conflict in some ways in the PCA. What do you think about that, Gabe?
Yeah, I think I do. I've long said this. It's funny because, as I said, when I first started realizing where we were, what was going on, I said to my wife, the conservative guys in the PCA are doing the same thing that conservatives politically have been doing for so long, is they put their nose to the grindstone and they work hard for the peace and prosperity of their city and those around them, to take care of their families and think of the future of their communities. And they don't put their head up to see what the progressives are up to. And we don't, because we want to do everything properly and honorably and according to the standards and the process that we have laid out. It doesn't occur to us to do things sneaky behind the scenes, creating a secret political arm or things like that. It's just not something that is part of a typical conservative person's personality. So we've had our head down working and just doing our thing in our local church and our presbytery. And a lot of stuff has been going on behind the scenes that I think that we just weren't really aware of. Well, now that we're aware of it, and this stuff goes back. I mean, I think last time I was on, I talked about this, PPLN and all that from way the beginning of the PCA formation. There was
that was the it was in the 90s, forerunner to the national partnership.
Right there, but I mean, it's been an issue, that type of thing, and we haven't engaged it well. We haven't fought it hard enough, and incidentally, whenever we do speak up about it, we're often admonished or called bad guys or nitpicking or things like that. But yeah, I think you're right. We haven't really given it a good, strong defense. We need to be a little more proactive than we have been.
Well, I usually say that it's my opinion that for many years, conservatives, confessionalists, I just call them cons, thought that because we had the Bible on our side, and the confessions on our side, and the Book of Church Order on our side, that we would win. Things would turn out properly, would turn out well, because for goodness sakes, we're in the right. So it has to work, the good guy has to win. But our doctrine of total depravity and understanding of human nature and the way people function in groups as well should have told us that was not the best idea. And this relates to the next point I have. One of the things that's tough about leaving or moving is the loss of fellowship. A lot of times, presbyteries are not huge. It can be 8, 9, 10, 12 churches. But you have real fellowship there, and you really do rely on those other churches and elders and pastors for various things. And, you're going to go to a smaller presbytery. You're going to go to a place where you might be in a presbytery with churches that are 400 miles away, like we see in the OPC often, where they have to fly to presbytery meetings. Well, we don't want to do that. I mean, maybe it's admirable, that level of commitment, but nobody wants that to be the way it works. You want actual local fellowship with some numbers of some significance. And that fellowship aspect is one of the reasons we may be reticent to fight. It's because we're going to make someone mad at us. We're going to make an enemy. It's going to be uncomfortable not just at General Assembly, but at the next presbytery meeting. And you have to be willing to risk those downsides sometimes. But that's a real factor in going to a smaller, new, different denomination for many people, and shouldn't be discounted. And some people just plain value unity, that place unity almost above anything else. I think that's misplaced, but we would hear that. A lot of progressives and moderates would, if you bring up something, they'll say, well, does that tend to unify? Or how does this how does raising this issue unify us? Well, the goal there is not really to unify, it's to reform. So reform and unification, unity don't always go perfectly hand in hand. I think we should recognize that at the outset.
Unity and good doctrine. That's where we need to be unified. And I think that they use that, that word is often misused. We all get along and sing Kumbaya is not, I don't think, the type of unity that the Scripture is looking for.
Hang on, I've got a clip of unity in the ideal situation. Let me see if I can get this to play. There we go. See, it's unite in the community. Okay,
right.
Yeah. Well, unity. My old Twitter handle used to be the Unificator. You can guess why I chose that, because I was not so unifying in some of the things I used to say. So all those things. I mean, these are just we're just talking, and we're talking about things we've thought about, and we're thinking about things we've talked about before, and all these things are considerations.
And for all the complaining, I would like to say that I heart the PCA. I really do.
Well, you should start a podcast and name it. No, it's too late. It's already
no, too late. I would never do that.
Well, hold on. Would there be an I Heart PCA podcast wwithout Presbycast to push against?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. See, we're creating unity right there.
Right. But as I mentioned, we just went through a pastor search. So when here we are in COVID, right, and we're searching for a pastor, and I was able. Now we're a good 45 minutes to an hour away from most of the other churches in our presbytery, Central Florida Presbytery, but still, when we needed someone to fill in we need a teaching elder for the Lord's Supper. Someone came over and spent time. When we went from one service back to 2 services so that we could offer a mask required morning service for those who just weren't comfortable coming without a mask, that they stepped in and served, preached 2 services, served communion I like that, served communion for 2 services. And it was great, to know that we had brothers right there that were faithful, that would come and fill in and help us out. Now, it was a little nerve-wracking. The ruling elders, we exhorted in between. So we would cover all Sundays but Lord's Supper. And then we call a ruling elder in a teaching elder in for that. So having that connection, that help right there is great. Multiple times we've reached out to the presbytery or GA. I've sent an email to the admin committee in Atlanta to ask a question, and you get an answer back almost right away. There's a lot of great things to be said for the PCA. I know that's not what the show's about, but I just didn't want to be come across totally cynical. The PCA is great. That's why I think it's worth fighting for.
Well, that's well said. And as we, of course, I don't want to go too much longer, but one of the topics I wanted to talk about was just the difficulty of being Presbyterian. I mean, I was thinking about that this week, that no one, and you sort of alluded to it earlier with your Baptist experience, no one's going to accidentally stumble into Presbyterianism. The natural form of government, be it church or civil or whatever, is either ruled by a strong man, a pope, or ruled by the mob, the congregation. And usually, in most congregational churches, it vacillates between the two. Like you said, if the pastor has 51%, he's going to rule. And if the pastor doesn't have 51%, he's going to be unhappy or run off. So it goes back and forth. And I'm sure in some cases, even, Episcopal systems can be swayed by individuals or the mob, as it were, unless they're established, and then they don't really need anyone's money, and they can do whatever they want to do, I suppose. But Presbyterianism is not natural in the sense that fallen humans are just going to automatically arrive there. Well, we can see Presbyterianism in infancy, even in the book of Exodus, with the way the children of Israel were organized, I think. We know that having a king was not the ideal, natural thing in certain ways for even the nation of Israel. And we believe that Presbyterianism is given in the Scriptures, not with the precision we would find in a book about Presbyterianism or our Book of Order, but we do find it there. We think it's biblical and that it's worth the trouble, but it's not easy. And we've sort of already mentioned some of those things that are not easy about it. We would also say that our friend Daryl Hart, he said this many years ago in the early days of Reformed Forum, maybe 2007. He said it's just hard to be a Presbyterian. The Reformed piety was not as convenient or ear-tickling or malleable or just easy to explain to your friends. And that's what a lot of our progressive or moderate brethren are trying to solve. They're trying to make this more user-friendly, more applicable, more practical, more, and this is more cynical, marketable, more palatable to certain demographics. And it's hard to do that. It's hard to make a mega church out of a Presbyterian church. So we don't want to spend much time on this, but your thoughts, or yours, Resby, on the difficulty of being Presbyterianism and why it's maybe it should be for everyone, but it's not.
Well, I go back to kind of what I said earlier. Is it's? I mean, dare I be circular? It's difficult because it's hard. It does it does take sort of a. I mean, it takes a commitment, especially in an age where, I mean, if your church is even meeting in person, which is just still an incredible sort of caveat that we have to carve out there. But if you have an afternoon or a PM service, that still looks weird to large swaths of culture. But the commitment to simple worship and sort of, that sort of like weird, awkward eye roll you get when people are like, oh, you haven't heard this, CCM song or whatever. And you're just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Those things sort of happen. All of us are, Southern in address. And so there's still always going to be that, like, you guys do what to babies now? That will always come up. I think when we first became Presbyterian, some people thought we were going to start handling snake venom, confusing Presbyterianism with Pentecostalism. So it's the things you never expect to be kind of sticking points. But the commitment has been worth it, and everyone now in my family has a taste of what good, simple, reformed, confessional, covenantal worship is. And it would be extremely hard to go to anything else.
Wait, let me bring Gabe back up. Gabe, is it hard to be a Presbyterian?
Things take a lot longer than they should sometimes. I think.
Well, so it's PresbyCast too.
Well, that's not where I was going. But yeah, I think it's though the system is great. I think it's biblical. It works. If you adhere to the system, it prevents you from being hasty in the decision-making process and the implementing of policy and things like that. I think it's a great system. Honestly, now that I've been one for 21 years, I don't think I could do church, to use a Keller term, any other way. It's funny though, when we were when Resby was talking, I thought, so again, growing up Baptist, we would talk back to the preacher, right? We'd, amen, hallelujah, that's right, brother, you preach it, we'd talk back. Well, I noticed that obviously I did not feel comfortable doing that when I started going to a PCA church. So somewhere along the line, I developed what my 16-year-old son calls the Presbyterian groan of agreement.
And
that's it right there. Yeah. Where I would normally go, that's right, preach it. I go,
Yeah, you just don't do that during the prayers, because I have a real problem with what I call the grunter moaner during prayers. I'll allow it with a pastor, but I had a visitor come in one Sunday and sit next to me, and he grunted and moaned the whole service.
I'm not charismatic about it, but you
was he sitting next to Odd Deacon though?
Oh, I don't know. We have a clip of you, Gabe, in your earlier life. Let's see here.
Oh Lord.
Now, soundboard's checked out again. Well, it was the typical "Hey man." I'm sure that's the way you did it. Let's see. Oh, I know what the problem is. The problem's me. Here we go. Here's a clip of Gabe.
Hey, man!
Yeah, there you go. It sounded like Nathan Rager, but it was you.
Yeah, that was me. Yeah. Now I just,
Yeah.
I'll have to keep that in mind next time you visit. Oh, hey, next time you come down, if you want to visit our American flag, it's now in the fellowship hall.
Well, that's a good place for it.
Yeah. Finally got it out of there.
Well,
Of
that's
course, I hope nobody's watching because I
that's
didn't ask.
that's semper reformanda, as they say. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up, but we're glad that you joined us and were able to. Finally, it's always good to have a Florida man on here to make Resby and I seem more reasonable and intelligent.
Speaking of, I saw that you said that Joe Exotica, it's official. He's going to get pardoned.
Well,
Joe
that was the
Exotic?
rumor. I don't think it's. I don't think it's.
His legal team certainly seems to think so.
If he pardons him and not Julian Assange, I don't even know what to think about that.
I don't know. We'll all know by the time anyone listens to this on their podcast player. They'll know whether that's happened or not.
I guess so. Yeah.
I mean, usually we've got like 51 minutes as of me saying this until like a true midnight pardon. So Eastern time, that would be really funny if you just decided to go off Pacific randomly.
This is the last Presbycast.
I mean, nobody paid attention to this month.
Right. This is the last Presbycast of the Trump era, we should say. For what that's worth and what it means, this is a historic evening.
Does that mean our show is going to get better or worse? I don't remember how good or bad we were.
Or it's going to move to Rumble or whatever.
Well, again, I guess we should say thank you to all of our listeners for enduring 300 episodes, which means much more than 300 hours, since we probably average about an hour and 10 or 15 minutes when you put the short ones in there. But
unless you're cooking.
Yep, we got two or three good. The next 3 episodes are already planned. They're going to be good. We'll start maybe next week with walking through Westminster, kind of a pastoral look at long, slow slog through the Westminster Confession, which we hope to do about once a month. Should take about another 300 shows to get through that. So, well, thanks, and Gabe, give our regards to everyone in Florida.
Will do.
And Resby will tell everyone good night. I should say that we put out a little appeal to help us upgrade our StreamYard account, and people pretty much came through with that. So we should have full HD, and we'll be able to do the multi-track recording in a few weeks when that comes out. So
they made a bunch of great upgrades.
Yeah, Gabe uses this at his workplace, so he knows what I'm talking about. Well, thank you, Gabe, and Resby. It's your time to tell everyone good night and what to do.
Hey, yes, thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for listening. If you're doing so, we appreciate it. Thank you for. I don't know. I think it's entirely possible we would have done this regardless of listeners or not. So we still might have hit 300 productions, whether or not. But we're here. So thanks to Gabe for coming on. Like Chortle said, I think the Westminster Confession series we're looking at doing is going to be pretty awesome. So please stay tuned into that. And again, keep your ears peeled and eyeballs open to the midnight pardons, and hopefully the humanoid Harambe Joe Exotic will be a free man very soon. As always, please don't be an Erdman.
Someday we will see that land in its beauty when God wiped away all our tears. The sun never set and the days eternal, and they count not the time by the year. Deep water, wide rivers, love waiting on the other side. I'll see father and mother, I'll see sister and brother when I cross that river deep and wide. They have safely crossed the mystic time. We'll meet them again at that home over yonder that is built beyond this divide. Deep water, wide rivers, love waiting
on the internet worldwide.